Just before 11 o'clock on the night of May 2nd, 2017, a quiet neighborhood in Coleman, Alabama, was interrupted by a call to 911. On the other end of the line was a husband reporting that his wife had shot herself inside her SUV, parked only a few steps from their front door. When deputies arrived, they found 32-year-old Tiffany Crawford sitting behind the steering wheel with a .38 caliber revolver resting in her left hand. To the responding officers, the scene appeared straightforward. The death was quickly viewed as a possible suicide. But that conclusion didn't survive for long. There was one detail that immediately stood out. Tiffany was right-handed, yet the gun had been found in her left hand. Then investigators discovered something even harder to explain. She had suffered 2 gunshot wounds to the head. And before state investigators could properly examine the vehicle, the SUV, the most important piece of evidence in the entire case, was handed back to the victim's family. By the following day, blood had been scrubbed away. Potential evidence had disappeared. The original crime scene no longer existed. How could the primary piece of evidence in a suspicious death be cleaned before forensic specialists ever had the chance to examine it? Was this the result of a tragic mistake? Or had someone been given enough time to erase the truth? To understand how this case unraveled, we have to go back to the years before Tiffany Crawford's death, long before anyone suspected that an ordinary family was quietly falling apart. To understand why Tiffany Crawford's death raised so many questions, we first have to understand who she was before that night. In Coleman, Alabama, Tiffany wasn't known because of controversy or conflict. Most people knew her as someone who was constantly looking for ways to help others. In 2013, she created a community group called Mothers Helping Mothers, a place where local mothers could exchange advice, offer support, and help families facing difficult times. What began as a small idea steadily grew into a thriving network. By early 2017, more than 8,000 members had joined the group, making it one of the largest parenting communities in the area. Outside of her volunteer work, Tiffany devoted most of her time to raising her 2 children, Tristan and Symphony. Friends described her as deeply involved in their daily lives, always making sure they felt loved and cared for. Whether it was organizing community events or simply spending time with her family, she appeared determined to build a stable future for her children. From the outside, her life looked almost ordinary. She lived in a quiet neighborhood. She was married. She was raising 2 young children, and she had earned a reputation as someone people could rely on. To many, Tiffany seemed to have the kind of life that others quietly admired. But appearances rarely tell the entire story. Behind the front door of that family home, pressures had been building for far longer than anyone around them realized. Those private struggles remained hidden from neighbors, friends, and even many of the people closest to the family. At the time, very few people understood that Tiffany had already reached a point where she believed difficult decisions lay ahead. Those decisions, and the events that followed, would change everything. Because behind the image of a happy family, cracks had already begun to form. Behind the image of a close-knit family, Tiffany's marriage had quietly begun to change. According to people familiar with her life, the relationship had become emotionally distant. Conversations that once came naturally grew shorter. The connection she had hoped to preserve slowly gave way to silence, leaving her feeling increasingly alone inside her own home. Over time, that loneliness led Tiffany down a path she never expected to take. She began a secret relationship with another man named Kyle Sunday. The relationship remained hidden, and Tiffany worked hard to make sure it stayed that way. At one point, she even pressed a hot curling iron against her own neck, creating a burn severe enough to conceal marks that might have revealed the affair. It was a painful decision, but one she believed was necessary to protect the secret she was carrying. As difficult as her situation had become, Tiffany wasn't planning to remain trapped in a marriage she no longer believed could be repaired. After the relationship with Kyle eventually came to an end, she didn't give up on the future. Instead, she started focusing on rebuilding her life. She accepted a job at a local grocery store and began saving money with a specific goal in mind. She intended to file for divorce, move out, and create a stable home where she could raise her children independently. The day before her death, Tiffany met with a licensed psychotherapist for a scheduled evaluation. According to the clinical assessment, she was thinking about the future, making practical plans, and showed no indication that she intended to end her own life. The evaluation described someone who wanted to solve her problems step by step, rather than escape from them. On the morning of May 2nd, she also wrote in her personal journal. Her words reflected determination rather than despair. She wrote about staying positive, holding on to her faith, and continuing to move forward despite the challenges she faced. Looking back, it seems Tiffany had already chosen the direction she wanted her life to take. She believed the hardest part still lay ahead. She had no way of knowing that before the day was over, the truth she had worked so hard to keep hidden was about to come to light. And once that happened, there would be no turning back. The morning of May 2nd, 2017, began like any other. Nothing about Tiffany's schedule suggested that it would become the final day of her life. She spent the day running errands and keeping appointments she had planned in advance. Earlier that afternoon, she dropped Tristan and Symphony off with a trusted family friend before heading to a cosmetic appointment. Later, she met another friend for dinner, giving the two women a chance to catch up and talk about what had been weighing on Tiffany's mind. During their conversation, Tiffany admitted that her marriage had reached a breaking point. She spoke about moving forward with a divorce and beginning a new chapter. Her friend encouraged her to be honest with Jason and stop carrying the burden alone. At that moment, Tiffany believed she still had control over how and when that conversation would happen. She was wrong. Back at the family home, Jason had been using Tiffany's computer. As he searched through her files and private messages, he discovered conversations that confirmed his worst suspicion. There was another man. The first phone call came not long afterward. Jason confronted Tiffany, telling her he knew something was wrong. Caught off guard, she denied everything and ended the conversation before saying much more. But Jason didn't stop searching. The more he uncovered, the clearer the truth became. About 2 hours later, he called again. This time, he confronted Tiffany with specific details he had found on her computer. Faced with information she could no longer explain away, Tiffany admitted that she had been involved in an affair. Jason's response was immediate. He told her to come home. After ending the call, Tiffany reached out to her mother. She explained that Jason had learned about the affair and admitted she was deeply anxious about seeing him in person. Concerned for her daughter's well-being, her mother urged her to be careful before returning home. Meanwhile, Jason began making calls of his own. He contacted people he believed might know about the relationship, trying to understand how long the affair had been going on and who had known about it. One conversation stood out. While speaking with a family friend, Jason remarked that he had already experienced the pain of infidelity once before and had no intention of living through it again. As evening approached, both of them were heading toward the same house. Neither knew exactly how the conversation would unfold. But after the truth had finally been exposed, avoiding each other was no longer possible. Within the next few hours, one ordinary driveway would become the center of an investigation that would last for years. As darkness settled over Coleman that evening, Tiffany finally returned home. What happened during the next several minutes would become the subject of years of investigation, expert analysis, and courtroom testimony. But when the first deputies arrived, none of that was yet apparent. They were responding to what had been reported as a suicide. Parked in the driveway was Tiffany's SUV. She remained seated behind the steering wheel. A .38 caliber revolver rested in her left hand. From a distance, the scene appeared quiet. There were no signs of forced entry, no reports of an unknown person fleeing the area, and no obvious indication that anyone else had been involved. Based on what they saw during those first moments, responding deputies treated the case as a possible self-inflicted death. Jason explained that he had discovered his wife inside the vehicle after hearing the gunshots. His account appeared calm, and officers continued processing the scene under the assumption that the evidence supported what he had reported. But decisions made during those first hours would later come under intense scrutiny. Normally, in a suspicious death involving a firearm, investigators work to preserve every possible piece of physical evidence before anything at the scene is disturbed. This case unfolded differently. Although state investigators had not yet examined the SUV, local authorities chose not to immediately secure it as primary evidence. Instead, the vehicle remained in the custody of Jason's family. By the following morning, several family members gathered around the SUV with buckets of water and cleaning supplies. Believing they were removing painful reminders of the tragedy, they began washing blood from the interior of the vehicle. Dashboard, seats, plastic panels. Even areas that would normally be photographed and examined by forensic specialists were cleaned before state investigators arrived. During the cleanup, Jason's father made two unexpected discoveries. He found several of Tiffany's teeth lodged inside the vehicle's air conditioning vents. He also located her personal journal. Both items were later turned over to investigators. But by then, the condition of the SUV had changed dramatically. When Alabama State Agent Joe Parrish finally obtained a search warrant and arrived to inspect the vehicle, the scene no longer looked the way it had only hours earlier. Most of the visible blood had already been washed away, whatever answers the original crime scene might have held. Some of them may have disappeared with the water. Even so, investigators still had one advantage. While the vehicle had been cleaned, the physical evidence already documented at the scene, and the examination that followed, would soon begin telling a very different story. By the time Alabama State Agent Joe Parrish took over the investigation, one thing had become painfully clear. The SUV had already been altered. Much of the physical evidence that should have been preserved was gone. But not everything had been lost. Some of the most important answers would come from a place no one could clean: the victim's body. As investigators continued reviewing the case, forensic pathologist Dr. Valerie Green began a detailed examination of Tiffany's injuries. Unlike the first officers who viewed the scene through the lens of a possible suicide, her responsibility was much simpler: follow the medical evidence wherever it led. One of the first findings immediately drew attention. The wound to Tiffany's left temple showed no significant soot deposits and no burning around the entrance wound. To forensic specialists, those missing signs carried real significance. The revolver had not been pressed directly against her head when it was fired. Instead, the muzzle had been positioned several inches away. That observation created an important question. If Tiffany had been holding the revolver herself while sitting inside the driver's seat, why wasn't there evidence of a contact or near-contact gunshot? Investigators didn't answer that question immediately. Instead, they kept examining the evidence. The bloodstain patterns inside the SUV raised another concern. Blood was visible across the center console, the dashboard, and portions of the passenger side. But one area stood out because of what wasn't there. The inside of the driver's door showed virtually no visible blood staining. For blood pattern analysts, absence can sometimes be just as meaningful as presence. The distribution suggested that when the shots were fired, the driver's door may not have been closed. If true, it would directly challenge the appearance of the scene officers encountered later that night. Then came another finding. Neither gunshot wound displayed the characteristics normally associated with a contact wound. In many confirmed suicides involving firearms, the barrel is pressed firmly against the skin, leaving distinctive forensic markers. Those markers were missing here. Each new observation, viewed on its own, raised questions. Together, they began pointing investigators in a very different direction. The final laboratory examination focused on the revolver itself. Firearms examiner Angela Fletcher analyzed the weapon for biological evidence. Only microscopic traces of DNA remained. There wasn't enough material to identify a specific individual, but the testing produced one important conclusion. The DNA profile was consistent with a male contributor. No single piece of evidence answered every question, but investigators were no longer looking at isolated findings. They were looking at a pattern that no longer aligned with the explanation accepted during the first hours of the investigation. As the forensic reports continued to arrive, authorities reached a decision that fundamentally changed the direction of the case. The manner of death was officially reclassified. What had first been treated as a possible suicide was now being investigated as a homicide. That decision transformed everything. The investigation was no longer focused on how Tiffany died. It now focused on who had been with her during her final moments. And the first person investigators needed to speak with was the man who reported finding her. Once the case was officially reclassified as a homicide, investigators returned to the person who had been there from the very beginning, Jason Crawford. Only days after Tiffany's death, State Agent Joe Parrish conducted his first formal interview with Tiffany's husband. Throughout the conversation, Jason appeared composed. He answered questions without hesitation and remained cooperative as investigators reviewed the events of May 2nd. At first, nothing about his demeanor seemed unusual. But one statement immediately caught the attention of investigators. Jason told them Tiffany was not ambidextrous. According to him, she had always relied almost entirely on her right hand and struggled to perform even simple tasks with her left. It was an important detail, because the revolver had been found resting in her left hand. Investigators made note of the inconsistency, but continued gathering information before drawing any conclusions. As additional forensic reports came in, they requested a second interview. This time, veteran investigator Jeff Rottenberg joined the questioning. Jason agreed to undergo a polygraph examination. The test itself would not determine guilt or innocence. Its purpose was to help investigators evaluate whether further questioning might be necessary. After the examination was completed, the polygraph examiner informed Jason that several of his physiological responses were inconsistent with truthful answers. The results were not what investigators had hoped to see. With that in mind, questioning became more direct. Investigators pressed Jason on the timeline. They revisited his movements that evening. They asked him to explain details surrounding Tiffany's final moments. The calm confidence he had displayed earlier gradually disappeared. Rather than continue the interview, Jason chose to end the session himself. He stood up, declined to answer additional questions, and walked out. Although investigators still lacked direct physical evidence linking him to the shooting, they continued searching for anyone who might have witnessed something important that night. The breakthrough came from someone they never expected: Jason's 14-year-old son, Logan. Logan had been inside the house on the evening Tiffany died. Unlike the adults involved, he had no role in the investigation, and no reason to shape his account around anyone else's version of events. He simply described what he remembered hearing. According to Logan, an argument had taken place outside the house. Then he heard the back door slam shut. Moments later came another sound. The child's safety gate opened and closed. Footsteps followed. Only then did he hear the first gunshot. After that first shot, he distinctly remembered hearing Tiffany scream. A second gunshot followed shortly afterward. Investigators carefully compared Logan's timeline with the physical evidence they had already collected. His account raised new questions about whether the sequence of events could be reconciled with the original explanation of a suicide. By now, detectives had accumulated more than isolated pieces of evidence. They had witness statements, forensic reports, interview recordings, and a growing list of inconsistencies. The investigation was approaching a point where every piece would need to be examined together rather than individually. When that happened, investigators believed they finally had enough to present the case to a grand jury. For nearly a year, investigators continued assembling the case piece by piece. No single discovery had answered every question. Instead, each new report added another layer to a growing body of evidence. The forensic findings challenged the original conclusion of suicide. Jason's own statements introduced inconsistencies investigators could not ignore. Logan's account provided a timeline that differed from the version presented during the initial investigation. Individually, each element raised questions. Together, investigators believed they formed a pattern that deserved to be presented before a grand jury. On May 17, 2018, almost exactly 1 year after Tiffany Crawford's death, a Cullman County grand jury reviewed the evidence collected by state investigators. After considering the case, the grand jury returned an indictment charging Jason Crawford with intentional murder. 4 days later, Jason voluntarily surrendered to authorities at the Cullman County Detention Center. There was no dramatic manhunt, No public chase. He walked into the facility on his own and was taken into custody to face the charge. For Tiffany's family, the indictment represented a major turning point. More than a year had passed since the night she died. During that time, they had watched investigators revisit a case that many believed had been closed almost from the beginning. Now, for the first time, prosecutors were formally alleging that Tiffany had not taken her own life. They were alleging she had been murdered. But the legal battle was far from over. Jason's defense team quickly challenged the strength of the prosecution's case. They pointed out that investigators had never recovered direct biological evidence linking Jason to the shooting. There were no gunshot residue tests from the night Tiffany died. His clothing had never been collected for forensic examination. And because those opportunities had been missed during the initial response, they could never be recreated. Those early investigative decisions now carried enormous consequences. The prosecution believed the forensic evidence, witness testimony, and surrounding circumstances told a compelling story. The defense argued that none of it directly proved Jason had fired the gun. The case was now entering a different phase. The investigation had reached its conclusion. From this point forward, it would be up to a jury to decide which explanation the evidence supported. Before that trial could begin, however, investigators would present their own reconstruction of what they believed happened during Tiffany Crawford's final moments. With the forensic reports complete, witness statements collected, and months of investigative work behind them, detectives attempted to answer the question that had remained unresolved from the very beginning. What happened after Tiffany returned home that evening? According to investigators, the sequence began shortly after she arrived at the house with Tristan and Symphony. The children were taken inside, while Tiffany remained outside with Jason. What followed was not a brief disagreement. Investigators believed the two spent a considerable amount of time arguing behind the house. The conversation centered on one subject. Jason had discovered the affair. Witness accounts and phone records suggested the confrontation had been building throughout the evening, and by the time Tiffany arrived home, neither of them could avoid discussing it any longer. At some point during the argument, investigators believe Jason made it clear that Tiffany was no longer welcome inside the home. According to the reconstruction presented by the prosecution, Tiffany eventually asked for something simple: her work clothes. She was scheduled to work the following day and wanted Jason to bring them outside. Investigators believe he did exactly that before turning back toward the house. But according to the evidence they had collected, that was not where the encounter ended. Logan's statement described hearing the back door close. Moments later came the sound of the child safety gate opening and shutting. To investigators, those sounds suggested someone had moved away from the house and toward the driveway after the argument. That sequence became an important part of their reconstruction. They believe Tiffany eventually sat inside the driver's seat of her SUV. The driver's door remained open. She was upset. Her head was lowered. The revolver that had originally been given to her for personal protection was still inside the vehicle. According to investigators, someone approached the open driver's door. The first shot struck Tiffany in the face. Evidence suggested she reacted immediately. The injuries documented on one of her hands were consistent with a defensive movement, as though she instinctively raised it after the first shot. Then came something investigators considered especially significant. Logan reported hearing Tiffany scream after the first gunshot. Only afterward did he hear a second shot. Detectives believed the second shot proved fatal. Once everything became silent, investigators believed the scene was deliberately arranged to resemble a suicide. The revolver was wiped. It was then placed into Tiffany's left hand. The driver's door was closed. From the outside, the SUV now appeared exactly as responding deputies would later find it. Investigators acknowledged that some physical evidence had been permanently lost before state authorities took control of the vehicle. Even so, they believed the remaining forensic findings, combined with witness testimony and Jason's own statements, formed a sequence that was consistent with homicide rather than suicide. Of course, a reconstruction is not a verdict. It represents one side's interpretation of the evidence. Ultimately, it would be up to 12 jurors, not investigators, to decide whether that interpretation had been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. After more than 5 years, that decision would finally be tested inside a courtroom. More than 5 years after Tiffany Crawford's death, the case finally reached trial. By then, investigators, forensic experts, and attorneys had spent years examining every available piece of evidence. Now, the responsibility shifted to a jury. Their task wasn't to answer every unanswered question. It was to decide whether the evidence proved Jason Crawford's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Throughout the trial, prosecutors argued that Tiffany had been making plans for the future, not preparing to end her life. They pointed to her recent mental health evaluation, her journal entries, the forensic evidence, and the witness testimony presented during the investigation. According to the prosecution, those pieces fit together to support one conclusion: Tiffany had been the victim of homicide. The defense presented a very different interpretation. Jason's attorneys argued that investigators had failed to collect critical evidence during the first hours of the case. No gunshot residue testing had been performed. His clothing had never been examined. There was no direct biological evidence proving he fired the weapon. They also suggested Tiffany had been under emotional strain after the collapse of her relationship with Kyle, and argued that the possibility of suicide had not been eliminated. As the trial continued, Jason made a decision that carried considerable risk. He chose to testify in his own defense. While describing the events of May 2nd, he recounted the argument that had taken place before Tiffany's death. Then something unexpected happened. During his testimony, Jason laughed. The moment drew immediate attention inside the courtroom. When questioned about his reaction, he denied finding the tragedy humorous. But he also admitted that, on the night Tiffany died, he wanted her to experience the same emotional pain he believed she had caused him through the affair. Even so, he continued to deny pulling the trigger. After days of testimony, closing arguments, and jury instructions, deliberations began. At first, the jurors struggled to reach a unanimous decision. Hours passed without a verdict. Then they made an unusual request. They asked to hear Jason's original 911 call once again. The recording was played for the jury. As they listened carefully, one statement stood out. Jason told the dispatcher that the revolver was lying beside Tiffany. Investigators had documented something different. Crime scene photographs and the responding deputy's body camera showed the revolver positioned in Tiffany's left hand. To prosecutors, that inconsistency mattered. It suggested Jason's description during the emergency call did not match what officers documented only minutes later. The jury returned to deliberate. On November 18, 2022, they reached their decision. Jason Crawford was found guilty of murder. For Tiffany's family, the verdict marked the end of a legal battle that had lasted more than 5 years. But while the jury had answered the central question of criminal responsibility, the consequences of what happened on that driveway would continue long after the courtroom emptied. Because even after the verdict was read, one final chapter of Tiffany Crawford's story still remained. Although the jury had reached its verdict, the legal process was not entirely over. Several months later, on March 10, 2023, the court held Jason Crawford's sentencing hearing. After considering the circumstances of the case, the judge imposed a sentence of 99 years in prison. Under Alabama law, Jason would not become eligible to seek parole until he had served the minimum portion of that sentence required by law. For many, the sentence represented accountability after years of uncertainty. But it could never undo what had already been lost. Tiffany's children would grow up without their mother. No verdict could change that reality. One decision made after the trial also continued to generate discussion. Ultimately, custody of Tristan and Symphony was granted to their paternal grandparents. The outcome surprised many observers, because those same family members had been involved in cleaning Tiffany's SUV before state investigators had the opportunity to conduct a complete forensic examination. Although no criminal charges were filed against them in connection with that cleanup, the decision remained one of the most debated aspects of the case. As the years passed, Tiffany came to be remembered for far more than the circumstances of her death. Long before the investigation, before the headlines, and before the courtroom, she had devoted much of her time to helping other mothers in her community. That part of her life did not disappear. Today, a purple bench stands in a local park in her memory. Purple was Tiffany's favorite color. The bench was created as a place where anyone feeling overwhelmed, isolated, or in need of someone to talk to could simply stop, sit down, and know they were not alone. In many ways, it reflects the same compassion Tiffany tried to offer others while she was alive. This case also left behind difficult questions that extended beyond one family's tragedy. Investigators were ultimately able to build a case that convinced a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. But many people continue to wonder how different the investigation might have been if the original crime scene had been preserved exactly as it was found. Could critical questions have been answered sooner? Could years of uncertainty have been avoided? Those are questions that may never have definitive answers. What remains is the reminder that every decision made during the earliest hours of an investigation can shape everything that follows. For Tiffany Crawford, justice eventually arrived. But for the people who loved her, justice could never replace the life that was taken. If this case has taught us anything, it's that the truth can be delayed, evidence can be lost, and memories can fade. But careful investigation and persistence can still bring hidden facts into the light. What do you think? After hearing all of the evidence presented in this case, do you agree with the jury's verdict, or do you believe there are still unanswered questions that remain unresolved? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy in-depth true crime documentaries built around evidence, investigation, and courtroom testimony, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss our next case.